Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Zombie Train. This is episode number 304, and I'm your host, Ellis, otherwise known as Train Man. This week, we are talking about a locomotive that I got their number wrong at first, and I had to go searching to figure out why it wasn't showing up in any database. But it was asked about by 2716 Productions, back on episode number 234. That user is now going by the name of Midwestern 261, but he asked, was 2716 an engine that the ZT used for faster and medium distance travels to double head with nickel plate 765? Well, I'll say one thing right off the bat. The Berkshires in general, they were indeed used for medium and long distance services, as you might expect, but they were rarely double-headed. One thing to remember is that, especially out in the Midwest, basically everything from the Rockies east, we didn't have a lot of long trains. There were countless numbers of alternate routes for us to use, and that meant that we could get away with a lot of shorter trains and still not worry about having major collisions or major traffic jams if something were to go wrong. So, I don't believe 2716 ever did in fact double head with 765. I know that, for a stretch, they were maybe not paired, but 765 was tasked with getting the 2716 out of where it was stored and bringing it to a place where it could get worked on. And it was one of the first engines that we did work on because, well, we knew that it was at the end of its rope, but we figured, well, it probably doesn't need that much. It maybe just needs a little bit of routine maintenance, and that's fine. But it turns out that it wasn't fine. The people that did the original work on it were the Toronto Raillands, as a matter of fact. So when I say one of the first, I mean that some of the original work on 2716 actually predates the Zombie Train Incorporated as a whole. The Toronto Raillands, being the people that spurred it, were not officially part of Zombie Train, but they did have their own locomotive that we had given to them, and which was 765. And they were pretty keen on doing operations for us in the northeast of the U.S. and in southeast Canada whenever they could and whenever we weren't around. So they definitely took interest in getting another locomotive. They had a fair number of trained crews, because Toronto was what it was, or the Raillands at least, being this downtown sector that was actually pretty impregnable. We learned a lot from them, although we originally bailed them out, so, tit for tat, I guess. They were really keen on getting themselves another engine, like I said. And 2716, because it was based in the same location, because it was, maybe not a similar engine, but it was at least the same type, blah, 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 blah. Or they are fairly similar engines, I believe. Yeah, I have that. I have that right? Or am I thinking of a different class of... Am I thinking of a different class of Berkshire, or am I not? I know there are Berkshires that were very similar to the nickel plate Berks, but this is a Kanawha. I think they're very similar, and I think that might be why they went for it. I wasn't present for these decisions. I only know that they said, hey, we want to get this steam engine out of where it's resting, which was where 765 was, and we want to get it operating, and then we'll have two engines instead of one. And that way, if one breaks down, then we'll have a backup, and if you guys are not around, they said, talking to us, the Zombie Train, the OG, then things will still be okay, because we'll still have another engine in reserve. And I sort of, I thought about it, and I figured, well, I don't know how much manpower we have to spare, you guys are gonna have to do most of it yourselves. We'll help if you need to get anything from, like, farther south than, than Pennsylvania. Or than, if you have to go into the south for anything, say something and we'll see what we can do. Because at this point in time, we were spending a lot of time down there. This, I think, was before Firefall. But it would make sense that I don't know. We spent time there before and after. We did a lot of cleanup work, and we definitely strengthened ties with what we did during and shortly after Firefall. At the same time, we also burned some bridges and made some enemies. But, stuff happens. Tit for tat. So, yeah, they wanted to restore this engine. Now I'm not even getting to what it was used for, right? So they took this engine up into Toronto. They figured out a way to get it into their shops, which, if you know the shops up there, the roundhouse that still exists, if you're familiar with it, you'll know that back in 2012 it was not at all connected to anything. And they had to pioneer, and this was one of the first new pieces of track that was probably built after World War Z, or after the Great Panic. I mean, it was during the war. But it was to access their facilities because they insisted that they do everything in-house. So, they did that, they managed that. I'm not entirely sure how or what it took to do, but I have seen that stretch of track many times, and it's impressive to know that they did this at basically the height of World War Z. And so, the engine went in, they did a little bit of work on it, the engine came out, and then it never stopped going back in. It was apparently much more on its last legs than we might have figured. I knew that it had been taken out of service because it just ran out of flue time, and the FRA back in, like, the 90s, I think, said, you guys need to give it a workup, and instead they said, no, we're going to work on 765 instead. Raising their middle finger to the Federal Railroad Administration. But, they do them, I guess. So, they really let 2716 sit by the wayside, and I swear to God, that thing was problematic all the way through Zombie Train Incorporated. I bet you if you started the engine now, it would be problems. They must have replaced every damn part on that locomotive with stuff that they built from scratch without plans. Just taking pieces off, figuring out how they are supposed to look, building a new one, putting it back on. They were really, really impressive, but really, really specialized individuals up there in the rail lands. Which, during ZT Incorporated, we would have loved to make better use of them, but like I said, they're very, very particular. And despite the fact that they had pretty strong ties to us, the reason that I haven't mentioned them a whole lot in the days of ZT Inc. is because they didn't do a whole lot in ZT Inc. They were very concentrated on, once we started nailing things down, they very much concentrated on, okay, well, what are we doing next? And they looked inward. They had 765, they had 2716, and that was kind of all they needed. They weren't really interested in spending man-hours working on locomotives that wouldn't directly benefit them, and we definitely butted heads over that a lot, but whatever, it didn't really amount to much in the end, Toronto is doing fine in this day and age, and so is most of the rest of the country, so, I don't know what really can be said about our interactions with them past the start of the Zombie Train Incorporated. I was going to say a couple years after the Great Panic, but it coincides. It lines up more or less. So, the 2716, as far as I know, made exactly 2 trips across Canada. And this was it running at the head of a train, running on its own, and it managed to survive those trips without anything major going wrong. Again, to my understanding, when they got back from the second one, the engine broke down and didn't run again for another couple of months. They were usually very quick workers with getting their stuff replaced, but there was a lot to tackle on that engine, so I can understand why it took them significant time to repair, a major issue. I don't know what that issue was. I assume it was something with a running gear, because, come on, that was like the only thing they hadn't replaced by that point. Maybe they snapped a rod or they twisted something up. I don't know. Running over the Canadian Rockies is certainly stressful for that locomotive, or for any locomotive, really. And if I recall, that second trip that it made was done in, February. So, they, if I want to think and see if I can remember anything from that episode, but I doubt that I can, because it was really, by that time, this was during the Zombie Turn Incorporated, not only did we not talk to them very much, but we had our own stuff to worry about. The engine did see plenty of life once they got it a little bit more on its feet. Like I said, 2 trips across Canada are, they're not something to shake a stick at. That's impressive by any measure. So, the engine did manage to do that. At the same time, it definitely presented tons of problems for the rail lands, and it was not at all their preferred locomotive. 765 was their go-to from the moment they got it from us to probably not now, because they don't really run steam anymore. Nobody really runs steam for much anymore. But, until they started getting their hands on a couple of diesels, which I know they had some diesels sitting around that they must use now. And these days, they're a little bit more open now that everything's a little bit more copacetic. So, we probably trade equipment and I don't even know about it. So, despite the fact that they lived in the same location for a very long time, the only time I think you would have seen 2716 and 765 double heading was when 2716 broke down somewhere and 765 had to go get it. They very much like using those engines in independent roles, because when you've only got 2, you can do a whole lot more with 2 than you can with 1. And I don't think they wanted to limit themselves to running just one locomotive, especially, towards the, especially right around the time that the Zombie Train Incorporated started, and in the short time before where they had the engine running and it wasn't broken down and ZT Inc. hadn't started up yet. So, that engine sort of ventured all over the place, where, I don't know, because I was halfway, or completely, not even halfway across the country, halfway around the world. I was on the other side of the continent doing God knows what. Battle of Portland, working with the Navy, all that stuff that happened in those years. And when I was away, they were top dog on the whole East Coast. And that's, I think, the real reason why they wanted to run their engine so hard, because, as much as we worked together, they were in it for them, and they wanted to make a good show. They wanted to say, look at what we've been doing, look at what we did, maybe you guys owe us something. And again, I was always a little bit cagey on just sort of giving stuff to them. We gave them an engine, that was good enough for me. So, yeah, that's the story of 2716. To my knowledge, it's still in Toronto. It's still in their roundhouse. It certainly hasn't gone back to Ohio, and I haven't seen it down here in a very long time. So, I assume that when they started being able to use diesels, they retired that engine immediately. I don't blame them. The rail lands, I mean, they made a good impression, that's for sure. We heard a lot about them when we came back from the West Coast. They really made an impression with the people way up north, like in Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont, because that was really in their neck of the woods. At least, being close to Canada. And they had a really, really dedicated team of laborers, not just for their engines, but for basically any track they came across. They rebuilt several things. Once they realized they could do that, they started doing it all over the place. They probably wasted a lot of material doing that, but I wasn't going to tell them not to. They helped rebuild the line that connected the main line there in Fabians to the base station at the Mount Washington Cog, so that you didn't have to shuffle stuff onto a truck or a van if you had gasoline, or a horse cart if you didn't, to take things from the station, which we would drop off lots of supplies, to the base of the railroad so that they could take stuff up to the summit. The reason that summit was so important, and I might have mentioned this before, is the fact that they had like a radio coverage area basically of all of New England and beyond, if they really pumped up their transmitters. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Trainman out.